I stood in the kitchen staring at the pill bottle, trying to understand why the water inside looked cloudy. For a few seconds my body went completely still. Not panic, not fear, that quiet pause I'd learned to respect, the one that came right before something went wrong. Epilepsy had taught me that stillness didn't mean safety, it meant awareness. My medication sat in my palm, soaked and useless, the routine I depended on suddenly broken. I could already feel the shift inside me, the subtle warning signs my family always brushed off because they couldn't see them. Behind me, my sister Rachel laughed. "You're just dramatic," she said, like this was another one of my overreactions. Like I wasn't holding the only thing that kept my seizures under control. I'd heard it my whole life. That I worried too much, that I made things bigger than they were, that I needed to toughen up. What no one ever seemed to understand was that epilepsy doesn't announce itself. It waits, quietly, patiently. That moment in the kitchen didn't turn into a screaming match or a family argument. It turned into hospital records, lawyers, and a courtroom where a neurologist had to explain out loud what my sister had almost done. My name is Emily Carter. I was 29 years old then. And that was the moment I realized my sister didn't just doubt my illness, she was willing to test it. The sound came first, a soft splash, plastic against ceramic, water where it didn't belong. I stood frozen in the doorway of the kitchen, listening to the last drop slide down the sink, my brain struggling to catch up with what my eyes were already telling me. The pill bottle was open. My pills, my routine, my safety sat submerged, cloudy and ruined. For years my life had been measured in doses and timing. Morning alarm, evening reminder, no skipping, no improvising. I'd learned the hard way that epilepsy didn't care about excuses. One missed dose could mean days of recovery. Two could mean a hospital bed. Rachel knew that. She'd been there after my first seizure at 16 when I woke up confused and bleeding from the lip. She'd driven me to appointments, rolled her eyes in waiting rooms, joked with nurses like it was all a little dramatic but manageable. That morning she leaned against the counter like nothing had happened. "I poured water on them," she said when I asked, her tone casual, almost bored, my chest tight. "Why?" She shrugged. "Because you rely on them too much." I stared at her, waiting for the rest, the apology, the "I messed up." Instead, she crossed her arms. "You're not fragile, Emily, you just think you are." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Those pills prevent seizures." She laughed, sharp and dismissive. "You've skipped before." Nothing happened. That wasn't true, but facts didn't seem to matter anymore. "This isn't concern," I said. "This is reckless." She stepped closer, lowering her voice like she was the reasonable one. "I'm worried about you, about how dependent you've become." Someone had to prove you're stronger than you think. Prove. The word echoed louder than the splash had. I realized then this hadn't been a mistake, not a careless moment. She'd thought about it, planned it, decided my body was a lesson she could teach. I picked up the bottle with shaking hands. My fingers felt slow, clumsy, a familiar warning sign. My vision sharpened in that strange way it did right before things slipped. Rachel noticed and scoffed. "See, you're already working yourself up." "I'm not," I said, though my pulse betrayed me. "I'm reacting." She waved me off. "You always do this, turn everything into a crisis." I wanted to argue, to explain, to make her understand the charts and warnings and years of medical history. Instead, a deeper truth settled in. She didn't want to understand, she wanted control. I went to my room and closed the door, sitting on the edge of the bed, breathing slow and deliberate like my neurologist had taught me. My hands tingled. The room felt too bright. From the hallway, Rachel's voice floated in, already telling someone on the phone that I was overreacting again. That's when the first tremor ran through me, small, subtle, but unmistakable. And as I reached for my emergency meds, thankfully untouched, I knew this day wasn't ending in a family argument. It was ending somewhere far more serious. I woke up on the bathroom floor, not fully unconscious, just far enough gone that the tiles felt cold against my cheek and the world tilted when I tried to sit up. My head buzzed, the kind of dizzy hum I recognized too well. It wasn't a seizure, not yet, but it was close enough to scare me. I stayed there for a minute, breathing slowly, counting like I'd been taught. One missed dose doesn't always trigger something immediate. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it stacks. That uncertainty was the cruelest part. When I finally stood, my legs felt weak, like they didn't quite belong to me. I checked the time and felt a rush of anger at myself, at the situation, at how quickly everything had become unstable. This wasn't new. What was new was knowing it hadn't been an accident. Growing up, my epilepsy had always been treated like an inconvenience. Something we worked around, joked about, minimized. My parents learned the basics, nodded at doctors, then quietly hoped it would fade away with time. Rachel took that hope and turned it into certainty. By lunch, my phone started buzzing. My aunt texted first. "Rachel says you're stressing yourself out again." A cousin followed. "Are you okay, or is this one of your episodes?" Episodes, that word stung more than it should have. Rachel had been talking, not to me, but about me. Painting the picture she preferred, the anxious younger sister who liked the attention that came with being sick. That evening, we had a family dinner planned. I considered skipping it, but something in me wanted to see it through, to prove to myself at least that I wasn't fragile. The table was loud with conversation and clinking glasses. Halfway through, someone made a joke about how many pills I took every day. "Must be expensive keeping Emily alive," my uncle laughed. Rachel smiled. "You should see her pill organizer. It's like a tackle box." Laughter rippled around the table. I smiled too because that's what I'd learned to do. Smile so no one felt awkward. Smile so the room could stay light. Inside, something folded in on itself. After dinner, I slipped into the bathroom and checked my bag out of habit. My emergency meds were always there, always, except this time the pocket was empty. My heart dropped. I searched again, slower, more carefully, still nothing. I walked back into the living room and met Rachel's eyes, just for a second, long enough to see the flicker of recognition before she looked away. I didn't ask her, I didn't need to. Back in my room, I sat on the bed, hands trembling, not with fear this time, but with anger sharp enough to focus me. This wasn't dismissal anymore. This was escalation. She'd taken away my safety net and laughed while doing it. I thought about the jokes, the messages, the way my body had been treated like a personality flaw instead of a medical reality. Then I grabbed my keys. If I stayed, I'd be waiting for symptoms, for permission. For someone else to decide how serious this was. I wasn't doing that. I walked out without saying goodbye and drove myself to the ER, headlights blurring slightly as the dizziness returned. For the first time that day, I felt clear about one thing. I couldn't trust my family with my health anymore. The ER lights were too bright. They buzzed softly above me as I lay on the narrow bed, one arm strapped with a blood pressure cuff, the other taped to an IV. Somewhere nearby, a heart monitor beeped in a slow, steady rhythm. Each sound felt louder than it should have, like the room was paying attention to my body in a way my family never had. A nurse asked me the same questions I'd answered 100 times before. Name, age, condition, medications. When I explained what had happened, she didn't interrupt. She didn't smile politely or suggest stress might be a factor. She nodded and typed, her face serious in a way that made my stomach tighten. My neurologist arrived not long after. Dr. Whitmore was calm, methodical, the kind of man who chose his words carefully. He reviewed my vitals, flipped through my chart, then looked directly at me. "You're lucky," he said. The word caught me off guard. "Lucky, you missed enough doses that this could have gone very differently," he explained. A breakthrough seizure was a real possibility. In some cases, that can be fatal. The room felt suddenly smaller. Fatal, I'd known the risks, of course. I lived with them every day. But hearing it stated so plainly, without softening, without apology, made my chest ache. "This wasn't forgetfulness," he continued. "This was interruption." A nurse handed him the medication bottle I'd brought with me. He examined it closely, then set it aside. "We're documenting everything," he said. "Timeline, symptoms, medication status, all of it." That's when I realized something important. This wasn't just my word anymore. It was becoming a record. As tests were ordered and notes added to my file, the events of the past 2 days started arranging themselves into something solid. Dates, times, effects, cause and consequence laid out in black and white. At one point, a woman in a navy blazer entered the room and introduced herself as a hospital social worker. She spoke gently, but there was a weight behind her questions. "Do you live alone? Does anyone help manage your medications? Do you believe someone interfered with your treatment?" I hesitated. Images of Rachel flashed through my mind, her laugh, her certainty, the way she'd brushed it all off like I was the problem. "She's my sister," I said quietly. The social worker nodded, not unkindly. "I understand, but I need to ask directly, did someone tamper with your medication without your consent?" The answer sat heavy on my tongue. Saying yes felt like betrayal. Saying no felt like lying to protect someone who hadn't protected me. "Yes," I whispered. She wrote it down. The sound of pen on paper felt louder than the heart monitor. "We have to take that seriously," she said. "Cases like this fall under medical interference." I swallowed. "What happens now?" She met my eyes. "There may be a report. In some situations, we're required to act." Required, my pulse quickened, not from my condition this time, but from the weight of what I'd just set in motion. I wasn't just a patient anymore, I was a case. As she left the room, Dr. Whitmore placed a reassuring hand on the rail of my bed. "You did the right thing," he said. I wanted to believe him, because somewhere deep down I knew this wasn't ending with a hospital visit. It was heading somewhere far more public, and I wasn't sure my family was ready for that. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating. It started before I even left the hospital parking lot, texts stacking on top of each other, missed calls from numbers I didn't want to answer. By the time I got home, the screen felt heavier than my bag. Rachel hadn't waited. She never did. The first message was from my aunt. "Are you okay? Rachel says you had some kind of episode again. Then a cousin. She's really worried about you. Maybe you should listen to her." I sat on the edge of my bed, still wearing the hospital wristband, and felt something cold settle in my chest. Rachel hadn't told them the truth. She told them a version where she was the concerned older sister and I was the unstable problem she'd been managing for years. By the next morning, the tone changed. My landlord called while I was making tea, my hand still shaking slightly as I poured the water. "Emily," he said carefully, "I got a call last night. Someone expressed concern about your medical situation." I froze. "Concern how?" He cleared his throat. "They said you might be a liability, that you've been having episodes that could be dangerous." Liability. Rachel's voice echoed in my head, calm and convincing, explaining my life to someone who had power over my housing. "I've never been a problem here," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "I know," he replied quickly, "but I had to ask." After the call ended, I sat there staring at the wall, heat creeping up my neck. This wasn't just gossip anymore. This was damage. Friends grew quieter too. Messages went unanswered. Plans were suddenly postponed. When I did hear back, the replies were polite, distant, cautious, like I was something unpredictable. That afternoon, my neurologist's office called. "Emily," the receptionist said, her voice professional but strained, "did you authorize your sister to speak on your behalf?" My stomach dropped. "No, why?" "She called yesterday," she explained. "Asked questions about your condition, your medication. She implied you weren't capable of managing things on your own." I felt dizzy, not from missed meds this time, but from the realization settling in. Rachel hadn't just interfered with my treatment. She was actively rewriting my reality. I thanked the receptionist, hung up, and sat very still. The pieces lined up too cleanly to ignore. The family messages, the landlord, the way people were pulling away. She'd gotten ahead of the story and framed me as unreliable before I could speak at all. That night, I scrolled through old messages from her. Little comments I'd brushed off for years, jokes about my memory, warnings about me overreacting, offers to handle things for me. It hadn't started with water in a pill bottle, it had started long before that. I opened my laptop and stared at the hospital portal. Test results, doctor's notes, timelines, all of it existed somewhere, recorded and precise, untouched by opinion or family politics. I took a deep breath and clicked the request button. Request complete medical records. If Rachel wanted to control the story, she'd done it by talking. I was going to do it with proof. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. The folder made a dull thud when I set it on the kitchen table. It was thicker than I expected. Heavier too, like the weight of it wasn't just paper, but everything I'd been trying not to see. Medical records have a way of stripping emotion out of memory. No drama, no family history. Just dates, numbers, observations written by people who had no reason to lie for me or for my sister. I sat down slowly and opened it. The first pages were familiar: diagnosis notes, medication history, seizure frequency charts. I'd seen versions of these before, but as I kept turning pages, my stomach tight. There it was in black and white: missed doses, interrupted medication schedule, documented neurological instability. One note caught my eye. The neurologist had written, "Patient reports medication tampering by family member. Symptoms consistent with sudden withdrawal." Tampering, seeing that word attached to my life felt unreal. I flipped to the risk assessment charts next, percentages, probabilities. Clear explanations of what could happen when someone with my condition missed even a short window of medication. Increased seizure risk, loss of consciousness, injury, death, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just facts. I lined the papers up in order on the table, building a timeline. The day Rachel poured water on my pills. The night I felt the warning signs, the missing emergency meds, the ER visit. It wasn't random, it was a sequence. And once I saw it laid out like that, the last piece clicked into place. This hadn't been a careless moment or misguided concern. It had been deliberate, repeated interference. My hands shook, not with fear this time, but with something colder: clarity. Later that afternoon, I sat in a small office across from a legal aid attorney named Marissa Lopez. She listened without interrupting, flipping through copies of my records with practiced calm. When I finished, she looked up at me. "Emily," she said gently, "this isn't a family disagreement." I swallowed. "Then what is it?" "It's medical abuse." The words landed hard. She explained it carefully, how interfering with prescribed medication, especially for a known neurological condition, crossed a legal line, how intent mattered less than outcome, how patterns mattered. And there's a pattern here, she added, tapping the file. I thought about every joke, every dismissal, every time Rachel decided she knew better than my doctors. I don't want to ruin her life, I said quietly. Marissa met my eyes. Protecting yourself isn't the same as ruining someone else. That sentence stayed with me. She explained the next steps: reports, documentation, the possibility of a hearing. The fact that once medical professionals were involved, certain processes moved forward whether I wanted them to or not. I felt that familiar pull of guilt, the instinct to minimize, to smooth things over. But then I remembered the empty pocket where my emergency meds should have been. Before I left, Marissa paused. I need to ask you something, she said, and I want you to answer honestly. I nodded. Are you ready for what comes next? The family group chat went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, not muted, not deleted, just empty. My last message sat there unanswered, the words looking smaller the longer I stared at them. I hadn't accused anyone, I hadn't explained everything. I'd only said I was safe and getting help. Apparently that was already too much. My mom called the next morning. Her voice was tired, careful, like she was stepping around something fragile. Emily, honey, maybe this has gone far enough. I closed my eyes. Far enough how? You know what I mean, she said. Your sister made a mistake. Families don't handle things like this in public. Public, as if the ER lights and heart monitors had been a performance, as if my body had chosen an audience. She poured water on my medication, I said. She took my emergency meds. There was a pause, then a sigh. Rachel worries about you, she just doesn't express it well. That sentence landed heavier than any insult. Later that day, my dad texted, do you really want this hanging over us forever? Rachel didn't wait long to make her own move. She called, voice sharp and wounded. Do you have any idea what you've done? Everyone's whispering, you've made me look like a monster. I didn't do that, I said quietly. Your actions did. She laughed bitter. You always loved playing the victim. Then she said it, the thing she knew would sting. You need us, Emily. You can't afford to burn bridges. And she was right about one thing. Rachel handled most of the family finances. She helped our parents with bills. She had connections. She was the reason I'd been able to stay in that apartment at a reduced rent. The reason my name was still attached to family support I'd never fully questioned. Until now, that night I lay awake replaying every conversation. Wondering if I'd misread things, if I'd overreacted. If maybe, just maybe, I was the problem they kept insisting I was. Gaslighting doesn't always sound cruel. Sometimes it sounds like concern. By the next day, the group chat lit up again, but not for me. Screenshots started coming in from a cousin. Messages where Rachel called me unstable, said my condition was getting worse. Suggested I shouldn't be living alone. My landlord called that afternoon. I just want to check in, he said slowly. Your sister mentioned some health concerns. I hung up shaking. That was the moment something inside me hardened. This wasn't about smoothing things over anymore. This was about survival. I drove to the legal aid office before I could talk myself out of it. Sat in a plastic chair, hands folded tight, explaining my story to a stranger who didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she nodded. This qualifies as medical abuse, she said calmly, and interference. The words felt unreal, heavy, final. Are you sure you want to file a report? She asked. I thought about the silence, the jokes, the missing meds, the way my family had chosen comfort over truth. Yes, I said, and when I signed my name, I knew there was no going back. The courthouse smelled like old paper and disinfectant. I paused just inside the doors, my hand resting against the cool metal rail, grounding myself. I'd imagined this place 100 times since filing the report, but standing there made it real in a way nothing else had. This wasn't a threat anymore. It wasn't a warning, it was happening. I walked down the hallway slowly, heels clicking louder than I expected. Every sound felt amplified, doors opening, muffled voices, the shuffle of paperwork. When I entered the courtroom, my eyes went straight to Rachel. She sat at the front, posture perfect, hair neatly styled, dressed like someone who knew she'd be seen. Calm, composed, almost bored. If you didn't know the story, you'd think she was the responsible one, the adult, the steady presence. Seeing her like that made my stomach tighten. Behind her, scattered across the benches, were familiar faces. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people who'd watched me grow up, who'd laughed at the dinner table while my medication became a punchline. Some avoided my eyes, others looked openly uncomfortable. No one waved. Rachel glanced back and caught sight of me. For a brief second, her expression flickered surprise, then irritation, before settling into something smug. As if to say, you really went through with it. The hearing began with procedural language, words that felt heavy and distant. Then Rachel's lawyer stood. He was polished, confident. He spoke about family misunderstandings and heightened emotions. He suggested I'd misinterpreted Rachel's actions because of stress related to my condition. She's prone to anxiety, he said casually, and unfortunately that can distort perception. I felt heat rise in my face, unreliable, emotional, confused, the same labels just dressed up for court. He questioned my medical history in a way that made it sound like a character flaw. He implied my reactions were exaggerated, that my sister had simply been trying to help. Rachel sat there nodding, eyes soft, hands folded like she was the one being wronged. I wanted to speak, to correct him, to explain that epilepsy doesn't distort reality, it sharpens it, that I knew my body better than anyone in that room. But my attorney's hand brushed my arm. Not yet, so I stayed quiet. I focused on my breathing, on the steady rhythm of it, on the fact that silence didn't mean weakness. It meant restraint. When the lawyer finished, the room felt heavier, like everyone was waiting to see if I'd crumble. Instead, the judge adjusted her glasses and looked down at the file. "I'd like to hear from the treating neurologist," she said. Rachel's posture stiffened. For the first time since I'd walked in, she didn't look in control. The door opened and Dr. Whitmore stepped inside, calm, professional, unemotional. He carried a folder under his arm and took the stand without hesitation. As he raised his hand to swear in, I felt something shift. This wasn't about family dynamics anymore. This wasn't about who sounded more reasonable. This was about medicine, facts, consequences. And as the neurologist opened his mouth to speak, I knew whatever happened next, Rachel wouldn't be able to laugh this off. Not this time. The room changed the moment the neurologist stood. Until then, the courtroom had felt tense but manageable, lawyers shuffling papers, family members shifting in their seats, the low murmur of procedural language filling the air. I kept my eyes forward, hands folded, reminding myself to breathe. I had done everything I could. The rest wasn't mine to control. When Dr. Whitman raised his right hand to swear in, the noise dropped away. He didn't look dramatic, no sharp gestures, no raised voice. He looked exactly like he had in his office, calm, precise, and focused on facts. That steadiness settled something in me. He began by explaining epilepsy in plain terms, not as a headline condition, not as a stereotype. As a neurological disorder that requires consistency, monitoring, and trust. He talked about medication levels, how they build and stabilize over time, and what happens when that stability is interrupted. Missing doses, he said, doesn't always cause immediate symptoms. That's part of the danger. The risk accumulates. Rachel's lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge waved him back. Dr. Whitman continued. He explained how water exposure can render certain medications ineffective, how even brief interference can disrupt absorption, how emergency medications exist for a reason, and what it means when those safeguards disappear. Then he was asked the question that seemed to stretch the air thin. What were the potential consequences of the patient missing her medication under these circumstances? Dr. Whitman didn't hesitate. Increased seizure frequency, he said. Loss of consciousness, injury. He paused, then added, in some cases, sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. The words landed hard. I heard someone inhale sharply behind me. Chairs creaked. A quiet gasp slipped out of the room before anyone could stop it. Rachel's posture shifted. It was subtle, but I saw it. The confidence she'd worn all morning, shoulders back, chin lifted, faltered. Her eyes flicked toward me, then away. Dr. Whitman wasn't finished. In my professional opinion, he said, the deliberate interference with prescribed anti-seizure medication placed the patient at significant risk. This was not a harmless action. It could have resulted in a fatal outcome. Silence followed, not the uncomfortable kind filled with whispers, the real kind, the kind that settles when there's nothing left to argue. For the first time since this began, no one looked at me like I was exaggerating. No one smiled politely or shifted blame towards stress or personality. The story wasn't mine to defend anymore. It belonged to the facts. Rachel's lawyer tried to recover, asking about intent, about whether vitamins could ever be considered helpful. Dr. Whitman answered without emotion. Intent does not reduce risk, he said. Replacing medication without consent is not treatment, it's interference. I watched Rachel's face change as the words stacked up, medical language doing what my explanations never could. She crossed her arms, then uncrossed them. Her foot tapped, then stopped. When the judge asked if there were any further questions, no one spoke. The judge nodded once, slowly. We'll take a short recess. The gavel struck sharp and final. As people stood, the room buzzed again, but it felt different now, quieter, heavier. Conversations paused when I passed. Someone avoided my eyes. Someone else gave a small, uncertain nod. Rachel didn't look at me. She gathered her things with stiff movements, jaw clenched, the certainty she'd walked in with cracked right down the middle. I stayed seated for a moment longer, hands still folded, heart pounding but steady. Whatever happened next, the truth had already been said out loud, and it couldn't be taken back. She didn't wait for the hallway to clear. The moment the judge called for recess, Rachel stood and turned toward me, her heels sharp against the marble floor as she crossed the space between us. The confidence she'd worn all morning was gone. What replaced it was tighter, edgier, like something finally cracking under pressure. "Are you happy now?" She hissed, stopping just close enough that only I could hear her. "You got what you wanted." Everyone's staring at me like I'm some kind of monster. I didn't answer right away. I could feel my pulse in my ears, steady but strong, a reminder that I was still standing, still here. "I didn't do this," I said calmly. "You did." Her mouth twisted. "Don't pretend this wasn't calculated. You humiliated me in front of the entire family." "I told the truth," I replied. "There's a difference." She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You always loved playing the victim, ever since we were kids. Every seizure, every appointment, it was always about you. There it was, not concern, not fear, resentment. You think you're special because you're sick," she continued, her voice rising despite herself. "Do you know what it's like to always come second, to have everyone rearrange their lives around your condition?" I stared at her, stunned by the honesty slipping through her anger. "This was never about helping me," I said quietly. "It was about you feeling powerless." Her eyes flashed. "I just wanted you to stop relying on it, on them, on the attention. By taking away my medication," I asked, "by risking my life." She looked away for half a second, just long enough. "You weren't supposed to make it this far," she muttered. The words hit harder than anything she'd said all day. I understood then what I'd been circling for weeks. This wasn't denial, this wasn't ignorance, it was control. She needed to be the one who decided how real my illness was, how serious it could be when it was allowed to matter. And when that control slipped, she panicked. "You're jealous," I said, not as an accusation, but as a realization. Not of my illness, of the fact that I didn't need you to survive it. Her face hardened completely. "If you just kept this in the family, none of this would have happened." I met her gaze, unflinching. "If you kept your hands off my medication, we wouldn't be here." For a moment, she looked like she might say more, like something ugly and final was fighting its way to the surface. Then footsteps echoed down the hallway and voices grew louder as people returned. Rachel straightened, smoothing her jacket, pulling the mask back into place. "This isn't over," she said softly. "They'll see who you really are." I watched her walk away, back toward the courtroom, shoulders squared like armor, but something had shifted. The fear I'd been carrying of being misunderstood, dismissed, doubted was gone. In its place was clarity so sharp it steadied me. This had never been about my health. It had been about her losing control over it. The bailiff opened the doors and called everyone back inside. As I took my seat, I knew what was coming next. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't bracing myself. I was ready. When the judge returned, the room changed. It wasn't dramatic. No gavel slam, no raised voice, just a quiet shift in the air, like everyone knew pretending was no longer an option. I sat straight in my chair, hands folded tightly in my lap. Across the room, Rachel adjusted her jacket, chin lifted, trying to look unbothered. If you didn't know what had just been said under oath, you might have believed she was still in control. She was. The judge began by summarizing the facts, calmly, methodically, dates, testimony, medical records. The words documented interference landed harder than anything else that morning. He spoke about responsibility, about intent versus impact, about how personal belief never outweighs medical necessity. Then he said it plainly. "This court finds that the respondent knowingly interfered with prescribed medication critical to the petitioner's health." I felt my breath catch, not in surprise, but in relief. The kind that comes when someone finally names the thing you've been carrying alone. The consequences followed. Restrictions on contact, formal documentation added to the record, a clear warning about future legal action if anything like this ever happened again. Not punishment for revenge's sake, but protection. The judge looked directly at Rachel. "What you described as concern," he said evenly, "meets the legal definition of medical abuse." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I didn't look at my family, but I could feel them shifting, chairs creaking, someone inhaling sharply. This wasn't a private misunderstanding anymore, it was public truth. Rachel's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. Rachel didn't respond. Her face had gone rigid, eyes fixed forward like if she didn't move, this might pass. It didn't, the judge concluded by addressing me. "You were right to seek medical attention," he said, "and you were right to bring this forward." That sentence did something to me, something quiet but permanent. I'd spent years second-guessing myself, wondering if I was too sensitive, too cautious, too much. Sitting there, hearing authority replace doubt, I finally understood I hadn't overreacted. I survived. When the session ended, people stood slowly, unsure how to act now that the narrative had flipped. A few relatives avoided my eyes, others looked at me with something like shame. Rachel stood abruptly. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, cutting through the low chatter. She grabbed her bag, her movements sharp and uncoordinated, and turned toward the exit. As she passed me, she didn't say a word, no apology, no explanation, just fury barely contained. The door closed behind her with a hollow sound. I stayed seated for a moment longer, heart pounding, not with fear this time, but with something steadier, final. This wasn't victory the way movies show it. There was no celebration waiting outside, no sudden reconciliation, but there was truth. And for the first time since the kitchen, since the water, since the laughter, I wasn't the one being questioned anymore. I stood up slowly, gathered my things, and walked out knowing one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, it would no longer be decided for me. That night, my apartment felt unfamiliar. Not because anything had changed, but because everything had. I sat on the edge of my bed with the lights off, listening to the quiet settle in. No phones buzzing, no family voices arguing in my head, just the steady hum of the refrigerator and my own breathing, slow and even. For the first time since the courtroom, no one was demanding anything from me. The ruling had landed like a shockwave, not loud, not explosive, just final. Rachel's version of events had collapsed under medical facts and sworn testimony, and the family didn't know how to reorganize itself without that narrative holding everything together. Some people stopped calling. Others sent careful messages that said a lot by saying very little. I hope you're okay. This is all so complicated. Families make mistakes. No one said she was right anymore. That alone felt like a strange kind of relief. I unpacked the small pharmacy bag the hospital had given me and set the bottles on my dresser. Then I took out the lockbox I'd bought earlier that day, heavy, solid, impossible to open without the code only I knew. Click. The sound was quiet, but it meant more than any apology ever could. That box wasn't about paranoia. It was about ownership. I started therapy a few weeks later. Not because the court told me to, because I needed to untangle years of minimizing myself to keep the peace. Session by session, I learned how often I'd confused silence with maturity, endurance with strength. I wasn't dramatic. I was surviving. My parents called once together, their voices careful. They said they wished things hadn't gone so far, that they hoped we could all heal eventually. I told them I was healing, just not in the way they expected. Friends I thought I'd lost slowly drifted back. A few admitted they hadn't known what to say. Others apologized for believing Rachel's version too easily. I accepted what felt genuine and let the rest go. Life didn't snap back into place. It rearranged itself. Months passed. Then one evening, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in a long time. Rachel. The message was short, no explanations, no defenses. Can we talk? I stared at the screen longer than I expected to. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. That felt like progress. I didn't respond right away. I placed my phone face down and walked to the dresser. I opened the lockbox, took my medication, and closed it again. Click. Whatever came next, whatever she wanted to say would happen on my terms, and for the first time in my life that felt non-negotiable. The message came late at night. I just finished locking my medication box, new habit, still strange when my phone buzzed on the counter. I almost ignored it. Most nights I did, but something about the timing made my chest tighten before I even picked it up. Rachel, can we move on from this? I'm tired of living like we're enemies. I read it twice, then a third time slower. There was no apology in it, no acknowledgement of what she'd done, just exhaustion hers, discomfort hers, a quiet request that I make things easier again. I sat down at the kitchen table, phone face down, and let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. Not anger, that had burned itself out weeks ago. What surfaced instead was something heavier. Grief, not for the relationship we had, but for the one I kept hoping we might have someday. The version where my illness wasn't a joke, where concern didn't turn into control, where love didn't come with conditions. Rachel's message wasn't about healing, it was about relief. She wanted the tension gone. The consequences softened, the story rewritten into something less uncomfortable to live with. I typed a response, deleted it, tried again. For years, forgiveness had meant silence, compliance, pretending things didn't hurt so no one else had to sit with the damage. I wasn't doing that anymore. When I finally replied, my hands were steady. Moving on doesn't mean pretending nothing happened, I wrote, and forgiveness doesn't mean access. There was a pause. The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Rachel, I said I was trying to help. What more do you want from me? I stared at the screen, the old reflex kicking in, the urge to explain epilepsy again, to justify why my life depended on boundaries she still refused to respect. Instead, I wrote one sentence: accountability. She didn't respond after that. I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled, like a door had closed the way it was supposed to. A week later, I received an email from the hospital. At first glance, it looked routine follow-up language, polite phrasing, but halfway through, my breath caught. They were notifying me that my case had been reviewed by the ethics board. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because what happened to me had raised serious concerns. The neurologist had pushed for changes, new protocols, clearer reporting guidelines, staff training on medical interference by family members. My experience hadn't just been documented, it had been recognized. I sat there for a long time, phone warm in my hand, thinking about how close I'd come to being another quiet story no one learned from. Another woman told she was dramatic. Another patient expected to absorb harm for the sake of peace. Rachel wanted forgiveness because it would make her life easier. What I wanted was something else entirely: safety, truth, and a future where no one got to gamble with my health and call it love. As I locked my phone and stood up, one thought stayed with me. This wasn't the end of the story, but it was the moment I stopped carrying her weight with me, and whatever was coming next, it was going to be mine to face on my terms. The letter came in a plain white envelope, no legal language on the outside, no warning, just my name printed neatly across the front like it belonged to any ordinary piece of mail. I almost left it unopened on the counter, assuming it was another follow-up or billing notice. I was wrong, it was from the hospital. I sat down before I finished reading the first paragraph, my stomach tightening as familiar words jumped out at me: neurology department, patient safety review, internal training update. They were informing me formally that my case had been added to their mandatory training materials. Not as a story, not as gossip. As an example, anonymized, they said, no names, no identifying details, but clear enough that medical staff would recognize the risk. A case study on medication interference by a family member. A reminder that harm doesn't always come from strangers. I read the sentence 3 times before it settled. Your experience will be used to help staff identify and prevent similar situations in the future. For a long moment, I just sat there, letter trembling slightly in my hands. All those nights I'd questioned myself, all the moments I'd been told to calm down, to stop escalating, to keep things in the family. And here it was in writing, confirmation that what happened to me mattered enough to change procedure. My pain hadn't been exaggerated, it had been documented. Later that week, I heard something else through a mutual acquaintance. Rachel had quietly stepped back from the wellness group she'd been involved with. No announcement, no dramatic exit, just distance. Apparently, questions had started circulating about boundaries, about qualifications, about whether personal beliefs belonged anywhere near other people's medical decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me. She wanted to prove she knew better than doctors. Now doctors were using her actions as a warning. I didn't feel victorious. If anything, the emotion was heavier than that, something closer to solemn relief, the kind that comes when the truth finally settles where it belongs. A few days later, the hospital reached out again, this time with an invitation. They were organizing a small educational session for patients with chronic neurological conditions. A panel, informal, voluntary. They asked if I'd be willing to speak. Not about my sister. Not about court. About living with an invisible condition in a world that constantly underestimates it. I stared at the email for a long time. Part of me wanted to say no. I'd spent years shrinking, smoothing edges, keeping my story quiet so other people wouldn't feel uncomfortable. Speaking publicly felt like stepping into light I wasn't sure I deserved. But another part of me, the part that had walked into a courthouse and stayed standing, knew the answer. I typed back a simple yes. As soon as I hit send, my hands shook, not with fear, with recognition. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about making sure no one else had to sit on a bathroom floor wondering whether their pain would be taken seriously. As I closed my laptop, I thought about how far the story had traveled, from a cloudy pill bottle in a quiet kitchen to policy, training, and change. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt ready to speak, not in defense but in truth. What I didn't know yet was how that truth would land once it left my mouth, and who would be listening. I stood at the front of the room, gripping a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, listening to the low murmur of voices settle into silence. There were about 20 people seated in folding chairs, most of them women, a few men, all of us connected by the same invisible thread. Epilepsy doesn't announce itself, it waits, and everyone in that room understood that in their bones. I didn't think I'd be the one speaking today, I began, my voice steady but honest. But a year ago, I learned something the hard way, and I think it's worth saying out loud. A few heads nodded. I told them about the kitchen, the pill bottle, the laugh that followed. I didn't name my sister, and I didn't need to. The story carried itself. I talked about how easy it is for people who love you to believe they know what's best for your body. How quickly concern can turn into control when someone decides your pain is inconvenient. For a long time, I said, I thought love meant tolerance, letting things slide, keeping the peace. I paused, letting that land. What I learned is that love without respect isn't care, it's entitlement. The room was quiet in the good way, the listening way. I explained what it took to stop apologizing for my boundaries, how hard it was to let my family see the truth without softening it, how terrifying it felt to choose my health over their comfort, and how freeing it was once I did. After the meeting, a woman about my age approached me. She looked nervous, hopeful. "My sister hides my meds when she's mad," she said softly. "She says I'll be fine." I felt my chest tight, not with fear this time, but recognition. "You won't," I said gently, "and you don't have to prove that to anyone." When I got home that night, I unlocked the small metal box on my counter and set out my medication for the next morning. The click of the lock used to feel excessive. Now it felt like peace. I thought about Rachel, not with anger, not even with sadness, just clarity. What she lost wasn't me, it was access, control, the ability to decide what risks I should take with my own life. That loss was permanent. Justice didn't come with an apology or a public redemption arc. It came quietly, in court documents, in hospital policy changes. In the way my phone stopped buzzing with pressure to forgive. It came in the form of safety. If you're listening to this and someone has ever told you that your pain was too much, that you were dramatic, that you needed to toughen up for the sake of family, hear me clearly. You are not required to suffer quietly to be loved. You are not obligated to explain your body to people who refuse to listen. And love never gives anyone permission to gamble with your life. Stay, speak, protect yourself. I did. And it changed everything.